You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examination. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
If there is a God, why is there evil in the world? This is an age-old question, a very difficult one, but one that's asked very often. And I can think of no one better than to have Pat Flynn and Dr. Gaven Kerr back on the show, returning guests, to discuss this very topic. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show. How are y'all?
I am doing well, Michael, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
Honored to have you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's great to be back. I've given up coffee for the day, so, I'm a bit strung out. My wife got me, a really strong coffee for my birthday, and I had to give it up today, so I'm drying out from coffee.
Okay.
I'll compensate.
What kind is it? I'm just curious, because I'm a coffee drinker, so I'm curious now.
It's called Skull Crusher coffee.
Okay. I have not heard of it.
Apparently 1 cup of it is equal to 2 or 3 cans of Monster. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah, I dare not try it. So.
Yeah. So I've been off it today. Yeah.
By the way, Dr. Kerr, I was telling you, behind the scenes there, I love the batleth there in the background. For all of the Star Trek lovers, y'all will undoubtedly recognize that behind Dr. Kerr. They have a legit, actually 2 batleths there, which I thought was awesome. The first one actually looks like the one that Worf has in TNG, and the second one, I haven't seen that one before, but
right,
it's pretty awesome. So I have to commend you on that.
Thank you. That's my wife's batleth. As I was saying, it took some well, not a lot of convincing, but I kind of had to talk her into buying it.
Wow. Well, she has good taste. I'll say
she does. She does.
Anybody who likes TNG is already awesome. So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. I don't know which one of y'all maybe wants to go first, Pat, Dr. Kerr. However y'all want to do it. But I just say, let's go ahead and dive in. Take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, let me get maybe just a few quick thoughts out. Just some opening remarks, and then Gaven can too. I think it's important to begin these types of conversations with the right expectations and distinctions of like what the project is that we're actually doing here. It doesn't need to be said more than once that evil is something that impacts all of us tremendously on a personal psychological level. There's just no exception to that, right? But there is an important distinction to be drawn, and it's drawn by many philosophers, but I think it's worth emphasizing. Between an emotional and pastoral problem of evil and a philosophical problem of evil. And the reason I say that is out of great respect for everybody who suffers in life, which just is everybody, right? And it's often far worse than they let on. It's often far worse than we even could imagine in many cases. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm willing to bet that this conversation will come off as somewhat cold and abstract, right? But I don't want it to come off as being uncaring. The job of the philosopher in the problem of evil is to try and cut through all the emotional fog that comes from the personal problem of suffering, which is exceedingly heavy, and try to get to the cold, hard truth of the matter. So they're just different categories of issues that we're trying to deal with here, and they're both very important issues, but my presumption is we're going to be dealing with the philosophical problem of evil, not the emotional problem of evil. So that was just the initial remark I wanted to get out first. But Gaven, please chime in.
Yeah. I mean, just to reiterate that, a lot of times when I teach this material, I point out that I make a sort of a comparison. Let's say you have, a cancer patient, somebody suffering from cancer. The approach that, say, a palliative care nurse or doctor would take with that cancer patient is something different from the specialist working in a lab for, effective treatments, possibly a cure of cancer. The specialist working in the lab is doing, the deep dive analysis into the cancer itself just to figure it out. Whereas the palliative care professional is dealing with the person who is dying and, trying to treat a person who is dying, and if they're terminal, sort of take care of them in their last days. Now, they're both involved with cancer, but it's in different ways. And I think that reflects what you were saying, Pat, that the philosophical approach to the problem of evil, specifically as a problem, is more like what the specialist in the lab is doing with cancer, trying to figure out cancer, rather than, the nurse dealing with the cancer patient. That's what your pastor does. That's what your priest does. That's what, your support network does when you're undergoing or suffering some evil, whereas the philosopher is just trying to figure it out.
Right. And one thing I do want to say in relation to that, and that's an excellent analogy, Gavin. Thank you for that. Is that I don't want to imply that the philosophical work can't have any pastoral effect, because I think it can, but we have to realize like when and where that comes in. So if I'm going and I'm visiting somebody who's in the depths of hell of suffering, a cancer patient, probably it's not wise for me to say, well, don't be upset. Haven't you seen that we've resolved the problem of evil? Right? Here's how. Right? Like that would, in fact, that would probably be a cruel thing to do. However, for ourselves personally, what I want to say is this, right? If we can work through the problem of evil, and on the one hand, if we feel that we have demonstrations of God's existence, metaphysical demonstrations of God's existence, and from that, we can see by the light of reason that God is perfectly good. God is perfectly loving. God is perfectly just. Then when I am in the throes of suffering, which all of us are at various times and many times, even if I can't see what the reason for that suffering is, the fact that I can't see what the reason is doesn't mean that I see there is no reason. And by what I previously already deduced, in fact, I see that there must be a reason. There has to be a reason, even if I can't see it. And I found that for myself and many other people I've talked with, that itself actually is quite therapeutic, right? So there is a sort of therapy, a philosophical therapy that can be had from engaging in I guess, the philosophical problem of evil. But again, it has to be heavily qualified for all the reasons that you just said, Gavin. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
I think, what that highlights is that, when you are undergoing suffering, maybe not sort of the depths of hell sort of suffering, which just requires, a pastoral approach where you're with another person and that person is with you. And that's the kind of approach which is needed in that depths of hell scenario. But setting that scenario aside, in other cases where suffering undergoes, when you can just realize that there is an intelligibility to the situation, that the situation isn't unintelligible, well, that's something that you can latch on to, and that's something which does bring relief to the suffering which is being undergone. Also, as well, and this is probably something that we're going to get into, there are some evils which are the result of human will. Of what human beings have willed, maybe not what I have willed, but maybe with something that somebody else has willed, and it has repercussion on me, and it brings about evil and suffering. In that case, then reflection on the problem of evil and reflection on the fact that this is a result of human will, that if it is a result of human will, then there's something that I can will to do to make things better. So let's say, there's awful things happening. Let's say, I've lost my job, I've lost my home, and all the rest is happening, and I'm just, being totally destroyed because of what somebody else has willed. Well, usually in order to get myself out of that situation, I have to undertake certain measures and take certain responsibility for whatever I can take responsibility for. Okay, so any little thing for which I can take responsibility in those awful sorts of situations will have a kind of, a snowball effect of helping me get back up on my feet. And so I think reflection on the problem of evil and the fact that there are some evils which are willed illustrates to a person that there's something that I can will in order to get out of that sort of situation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, again, we have to start with a number of distinctions before we really dive into the depths of this of this important consideration. And you brought up one, and that's a traditional distinction between natural evils and moral evils, right? And we'll get into that, right? Another distinction between, so we've drawn two distinctions so far, the distinction between the philosophical and the pastoral problem of evil, a distinction between natural evils and moral evils, which we'll get into more later. Another distinction I want to draw is a distinction that's seen, that's made fairly often in the literature on this problem. That's a distinction between a defense and a theodicy. And the difference between these two is something like this, right? So a defense is when the theist will say, okay, skeptic, here's why your problem of evil doesn't work, right? It tries to block the problem of evil by undermining some of the premises or assumptions or whatever, and say, here's why it just doesn't go through. And since we already have an argument for God on the table, this is why we should be theists, right? So it's enough just to diffuse the problem of evil without solving or answering the question of why does God allow evil in general or any particular instance. Now, when you cross that line, when you start to try to answer the question of, well, why does God allow evil, or why did he allow this evil or that evil? That's when you start to do a theodicy. And again, it's important to have these distinctions, because what are you after, right? And for some people, it might be enough just to see that defenses work, because you might already feel like, oh, I already have demonstrations of God. So as long as the problem of evil isn't like a real logical problem of evil, right? That evil in some sense is just strictly incompatible with the existence of God, then there's a clear asymmetry, right? I've got the demonstration for God. The problem of evil doesn't go through. It seems like I should be a theist, right? And then I can just kind of leave a question mark on the theodicy question. Presumably God has reasons. In fact, he must have reasons based on the demonstrations, but I have no idea what those reasons are. Now, I think theodicy is very fruitful, and I think people should engage in it, but they're different projects, right? Me personally, most of what I've done is on the side of defense. I've not done a lot on the side of theodicy, and I imagine that most of what I'll have to offer in this conversation will be on the side of defense. But I wanted to just get that distinction out there as well, and see if you had anything else to add to it before we go further, Gavin.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I suppose initially when I first started engaging with the problem of evil, it was really just on that, sort of defense. Okay, how do we diffuse this? How do we, sort of challenge this premise or that premise? To show that God and evil are consistent with each other. But I suppose it's just the older that I get, the more I'm interested in well, I suppose just the more I'm interested in God's overall plan for the universe and me within it, and that tips me more towards that theodicy side of things. So I've got the defense. I know that God exists and all that, but now I'm thinking, well, what's the significance of the evil that occurs in the world, the suffering in my life, within God's plan for me?
Yeah,
I want to know what that significance is, and that has a spiritual dimension to it as well, but it also has an important philosophical dimension to it. Is there any way that we could say that God has some sort of purpose or some reason that of the suffering that occurs in the world, out of which he makes use? And I know, Eleanor Stump, she wrote an excellent book on that.
It's my favorite book on that.
Yeah. I think that was just a real eye opener for me. That book, I thought it was amazing, just on the redemptive nature of suffering and the good which is brought about in return for suffering undergone. I'll not spoil the end.
But the book is called Wandering in Darkness, for those who want to grab it, and I cannot endorse it enough. It's one of my favorite books of all time, not just on a particular problem.
I think it's probably the best book which has been written to date on the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. I couldn't recommend it any more highly.
Right. Yeah. So Gavin, I don't disagree with anything you say. Like, I am very personally interested in the theodicy, and I'm extremely attracted to Stump's theodicy as well, especially how she later ties it into the atonement. I just wanted to draw the distinctions up front again, so people have the right expectations that a successful defense is still a success, even if we don't engage in theodicy. Right. Yeah. Now, we may want to, and I think we should want to do more, but once we go and do more, once the defense is on the table, what we're doing more at that point, I think, should be done as theists. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, because the theodicy, it sort of subsumes the defense into the wider sort of metaphysical and theological outlook, if you want to bring the theological outlook into it. But it subsumes that defense into the wider metaphysics of the matter, asking, for the purposes of suffering and evil within the plan of, an all good God. And so that's going to take in, what you say, it's going to take in theism, and it's also going to take in revelatory claims and whatever else.
Right. Now, there's also, I want to say one more thing. I was talking with our friend Jim Added about this the other day, is that there are a number of defenses out there that I think are actually pretty good as far as defenses go, but I don't think they're true, so I don't promote them.
Right. Okay.
You see what I'm saying? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that theists should pay attention to, is just because something can diffuse an issue and it might be useful for diffusing an issue, I would be hesitant to adopt it only because of that. Any defense that I give in this conversation, I'm only going to give because I think it's actually true,
Yeah.
or at least very plausibly true.
Yeah.
Whereas there might be another defense. I'll put one out there, like Plantinga's free will defense, for example. I think that's many people think that's a successful defense. I don't think it's true though. So you won't see me defending Plantinga's account on this. So there's maybe we're doing too many distinctions up front. We should just get into it. But I think these are just important considerations going forward, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's important to bear in mind, because a lot of the times philosophers can get caught in these, I would just call them games, really, where they just, if one philosopher has a position, then the other philosopher thinks it's sufficient just to maybe say, oh, well, look, there is a possible world in which, this premise of this sub-premise of that heading of that sub-premise wouldn't be true. And thus I've refuted your position, job done.
Right.
That tends to be the way they go. And it's sort of the point that you're making, that just because you can diffuse the problem doesn't mean that you've given an adequate defense. The question is, well, is it true?
Right.
And I think that that's an important point to make, that we should only, just generally in philosophy, we should only engage in defending philosophical positions that we think are true.
Right.
That may seem like, a bit of a tautology, but when you read an awful lot of philosophy, for some reason, that's not what philosophers
You realize
are doing.
that's not the case. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly why I wanted to bring that up. So, all right, good. All right. So let me get out like one or two more distinctions, and then we'll dive in here. One is, and now they just sort of leaped out of my mind. Problems of evil. All right, there's essentially two broad kinds. One is a logical problem, like a very strong form problem of evil that you would see like Mackey pushing in his earlier work, right? That there's like just some straight out strict logical incompatibility between God and evil, right? And we'll talk about that. There's another problem of evil, which would be called the evidential problem of evil, or probabilistic problem of evil, and that says, okay, maybe there isn't a strict logical improbability here. But it just seems like the fact that evil exists, or the types of evil, or the sheer cumulative weight of evil, it just seems to make God's existence so improbable, improbable to the point that we just shouldn't be theists, right? And again, these are two different problems of evil, right? So how you deal with one might not be how you deal with the other one, and then I also want to say that there's ways that theists can offer a defense, but there's also ways that a theist can go on the offense from evil as well, which I've been interested in doing recently more in my written work. I have an article on Catholic Answers that just went up to try to do something like that. All right, so that's all I had to say by way of preliminary remarks, Gavin. So should we just start with the Epicurean paradox and see where it goes from there, or where do you want to begin?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just put out the problem in its logical form, and then we'll go through it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, the way that it goes is it's what's known in philosophy as a modus tollens. Okay, modus tollens is if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. It's a perfectly logical argument, and the problem of evil then is that if God exists, then evil doesn't exist. Evil does exist, therefore God doesn't exist. And God here, he's understood to be omnipotent, omniscient, all good. So he knows that there's evil. He has the power to eradicate evil. And if he's all good, he should at least want to eradicate evil. So there's some sort of inconsistency here. We have the plain fact of evil around us. So why God? Why do we have this? Well, maybe no God, because, evil is, just so evident that it would just seem to show that, there is no God. So,
yeah. All right. So all right. So we've got it out. Now the question is, where do we want to attack it? Right now, now some people will kind of attack the first premise. So if God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. If God is all good, then he wouldn't create a world of evil and suffering. But just take a look around, guys. There you go. Right. Some people will kind of jab at that first premise and say, well, we have to qualify omnipotence, right? Omnipotence refers to God's being able to bring about any possibilities of being. But we often sometimes get played by tricks of language, right? Like God can't bring about a square circle. That's not a real possibility of being, right? So then this is where your traditional free will defenses come in, right? And you say, well, if God decides to create a free being, but then he sort of, only makes that free being make the right decisions all the time, then do we really have a free being? Is that a contradiction, right? Now that's fine. That's worth a consideration, but I actually don't take that approach, right?
No, me neither.
I don't take that approach. I go for the second premise, right?
Yep.
And the second premise says that if God exists, he would not create a world of suffering and evil. And I think that is an easy premise to take down, because as far as defense goes, we only have to show that there's some possible reasons that God could permit morally the suffering of evil in the world, the possibility of sin, and then we're free and clear from there. So are we in agreement that it's the second premise that we need to go after this, Gavin?
Well, actually, we're not.
We're not. Right.
So the premise that I go after is the statement that evil exists. So right. I'm gonna go for your typical Augustinian, Platonic, denial of the reality of evil. No, that's that's going to be heavily qualified, but that's what I'm going to go for, and I think that that's helps us to resolve the problem.
Right. So all right, we don't disagree then, because I think that's all part of the solution. I think a defense has multiple steps of the solution, and one, as you've indicated, is that there's an ontological asymmetry between good and evil, right? Mm-hmm. And the gist here, and then I'll let you fill in the details, is that whatever is good has being. All being has goodness. Yeah. And that what evil is it's specifically a privation. It's not just a negation. It's a privation. Mm-hmm. And by a privation, we mean that it's a do good gone missing. Yeah. It's something that's proper to the perfection of a particular thing that should be there for its perfection, but for some reason it isn't, right? So like sight for eyes, for example. Now, blindness isn't something that we can grab, right? It's not something that we can touch. It's something that's missing that otherwise should be there. And the reason this is important, just as a quick sketch, is because if God is the author of only things that have being, but evil has no positive ontological status, well, we're already starting to see an asymmetry. We're starting to see a symmetry breaker there. That's the way you want to go with it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think we should maybe backtrack to the point you made about omnipotence, because I think that's an important part of the story here. So do you mind if we look at that?
Take it away, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned omnipotence, and usually when people hear the term omnipotence, they think, oh, well, omnipotence just means God can do anything he wants.
Right.
And now, technically, that's a position known as voluntarism. That if God wants 2 + 2 to equal 5, well, then God can make it be the case that 2 + 2 = 5, and so that's a voluntaristic sort of outlook. But what's known as the intellectualist approach takes a different matter. Omnipotence is that God's power is constrained by nothing. Okay. Because on the Thomistic approach, God is pure existence itself. So outside of him, there is nothing unless he has created it. Okay? So God's power is constrained by nothing. Now, what is nothing? Okay? Nothing is signified by impossibility. Okay? The law of contradiction. So a thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. All the usual qualifications. So any state of affairs whose propositional formulation admits of a contradiction is nothing. It could not be. Why? Because it's impossible. Possibility is a necessary but not sufficient condition for actuality. So God can bring about any possibility, but he can't bring about an impossibility, because an impossibility is nothing at all. And nothing at all isn't something that can be brought about. So that's the point. So when we say that God can't do something like, make a squared circle, we're not saying that he can't do it because it's just really too hard for him, as if it were, he was trying to deadlift a weight that he couldn't lift. It's not that. It's that's something that in itself could not be done. And that's the more intellectualist approach of to omnipotence. Now that's going to be part of our story, because if I'm going to, at least going to be part of my story, my sort of defense against the problem of evil, because if I'm going to argue that evil is a negation, or not a negation, privation, some sort of deprivation of the good, well, then the question is going to be, well, why didn't God just create a universe without any deprivations? And the point is, you can't have a creature any sort of an effect which isn't limited in the good in some sort of way, because anything other than God that exists is lesser than and dependent on God. It is good, but only good in a limited and in participated way. Right. So it's lesser in the good in some sort of way, and that lessening of the good, that's where the deprivations, which we call evil, come in. And so it's not open to the power of an omnipotent being understood in that way to bring about a universe without deprivations.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A lot of good stuff here. And I think it's going to connect to part of the reason I wanted to go after the second premise. And I think we'll see some interesting convergence here. So, anything that God creates, it both is and it is not, right? It is this, but it's not that, right? Yeah. And this is what that thing is, but it's also not that other thing, right? It's always qualified by a this, but not that. It's a limited being. It's a particular instantiation, right? Which means that whatever else God creates, it's always to some degree shot through with nothingness, right? Now, why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. One is that if God wants to aim for something that is really good, say, and I'm going to borrow from Jacques Maritain here a little bit. If he wants to aim for friendships, love, and communion, for example, which I think we all say that God does want to aim for that, based at least on revelation, right? We have to require the union of two free independent wills. Now, again, there's an asymmetry here. God is free, but he's also perfect because God is the subsistent good himself. God is naturally impeccable, right? God is his own moral rule, just because God is the moral rule. He is the moral standard, right? Given divine simplicity. However, anything else God creates that is free, but naturally imperfect. It's always going to be a liberty that's qualified by a fallibility, right? Because it will always have to look beyond something for that moral standard, for that moral rule. So this is where Maritain comes in, because he says, actually, could God give such special graces to constantly override our fallibility all the time? Yes, right? But God can't create a naturally impeccable being. That is like a square circle. That's what Maritain says, right? So if God is going to create any free being at all, and he's aiming for the supreme good of friendships, love, and communion, it is going to be naturally able to fail. That's just what it means. That's what it means to be us, right? And there's a poignant beauty to this, right? That who we are on the deepest existential level is a being that is free, but fallibly free, always liable to fail, right? Now that's important for a number of considerations, but one consideration that always has struck me about Maritain is because I do want to hold that God could give special graces and cause us to always do the morally perfect thing, right? However, why wouldn't he do that? Well, because God is perfectly wise as well. And when God creates things with a particular nature, he's going to govern them in the general run according to the type of thing that they are, right? Because if not, you're just performing miracles all the time, right? And if God was constantly performing miracles, it would really kind of make nonsense of creation. And God isn't in the business of creating nonsense either. So I think something that's overlooked in the free will debate in the contemporary literature, Gavin, I'd be curious your thoughts on this, are two things. One is an admission that God actually could move us all by special graces to always consider the moral rule, but that God probably in the general run wouldn't, because God created a particular nature, and a wise God he plays fair, as Maritain calls it, right? He guides things according to the type of thing they are. And it might just be, and I think it is, just a strict impossibility for God to create anything that is naturally free, but also impeccably free, because only God is impeccable. What do you think of that, and how do you think that connects with what you've drawn out so far?
Yeah, I think that's right, because when you look at the metaphysics of creation, God creates by granting existence to things. The things to which he grants existence, trees, rocks, animals and stuff, they exist as the kinds of things that they are. So their existence is individuated to them as the kind of things that they are. So when we talk about God governing or guiding creation, he's governing or guiding things in terms of granting them existence. Okay, so that's how, sort of God engages with things, and he grants them existence as the things that they are. Now, the position that you refer to there, that, when it comes to moral agents, couldn't God just, give us, a special grace by which we're made infallible, for any particular moral situation that we come across, so that we never commit a moral evil? Well, he could, but that would be like going back to metaphysics and ontology. That would be like a position known as occasionalism, whereby creatures don't act as proper causes and effects of each other. They don't have any genuine causal relations to each other. Rather, if I, sort of, Pat, you're not here, but if I hit you with my nunchucks, okay, and cause brain damage, I don't actually cause the brain damage in you, that activity there is the occasion for God to bring about brain damage in you. So for God directly to act on you. So what occasionalism does, it removes the proper causal relations between creatures. And so when it comes to the will of free creatures, God could just, constantly give us, new graces. But I mean, creation isn't occasionalist. God creates things. Things have their own acts of existence and their own actualities, and they can engage in their own causal relations with each other whilst participating in the existence that God gives them.
Right.
And so when it comes to free agents who can act as causes, they can act freely within the context of the existence that God's given them. And they don't need to be given special graces from God to know what the good is and to do the good. It's only if God has some sort, and I mean, this is to bring in a bit of scripture. It's only whenever God has some sort of, redemptive providential plan. So some providential plan pertaining to, his redemptive work, that special graces are given then. So that freely willed creatures will, infallibly see the good which is to be done, and they'll be given the character to pursue that good.
Right.
How does that sit with you, Patrick?
I think it's great. And as Catholics, we certainly have to admit to those special cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about that, but they're sort of like miracle cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like they're always going to be heavily qualified as opposed to the general run. Now, the other thing I want to bring up here is oftentimes a sort of traditional response, and I think is fair in and of itself, but also needs to be qualified. The problem of evil is that, well, if God didn't give us this significant moral autonomy, like, yeah, maybe God could just cause us to always consider the good in any particular instance, and we would still be free, given a certain particular conception of freedom. So I do sort of style myself a libertarian with qualifications, at least a sourcehood form of libertarian free will, right? But I don't, and I'm with Stump here, that doesn't require the PAP, as they call it. Sounds kind of nasty, the PAP. The PAP just means the principle of alternative possibilities, right? And I don't think theists should accept that, especially those who believe in the beatific vision, right? But I think there's other examples where we can show that freedom doesn't necessarily require the principle of alternative possibilities. So we can bracket that off if it becomes relevant later. For now, what I want to say is this, is that sometimes people will say, yeah, maybe God could always consider, cause us to consider the moral rule, but then if he does that, there will certainly be at least some goods that seem really good that just wouldn't be possible in creation. Goods like forgiveness, goods like mercy, goods like the atonement itself, right? Or compassion, right? If he doesn't allow suffering, then we can never really have like this type of compassion or care and stuff like that. And I think we all agree that those are supremely good goods. And I think that response is effective as far as it goes. But I always want to qualify it, right? Because I don't want to make it seem like God is saying, okay, I'm going to allow evil so that way people can be compassionate to one another. That always strikes me as profoundly naive and wrong. Yeah. What I want to say is this: God wants friendships, love, and communion with us. And in doing that, he has to create free beings like us that are naturally fallible. Now, he lets us fail, right? Not because he's aiming for those other goods, but because he can draw those other goods out if we do fail. That's how I think that needs to be stated. Do you agree with that?
And you ruined the punchline.
What's that?
You ruined the punchline.
Oh, of Stump's book?
Yeah. So
not all of it. So yeah.
So the great good, that can redeem any evil undergone in the world is the friendship of God himself. We receive God in return. Yeah. Yeah.
But you see like the kind of ordering there that I'm trying to emphasize, right? Because otherwise it just kind of could make God seem like a weird utilitarian, right? Now, I think it's always a mistake to import our moral assumptions about us to God anyways, which we'll get to. But I still think that there's just kind of something wrong about thinking it in that particular way without the qualifications that we've made, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Could we swing back to evil as a privation? Because, I mean, we give the general gist of it, but maybe we could just, sort of go a wee bit deeper as to the reasoning behind it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, because it's a fairly unintuitive notion. Why would anybody want to challenge, that premise of the problem of evil? Because that seems to be, of any of the premises which is solid, that seems to be the most solid one. But I think we tend to think of evil as a thing, as some sort of substance. And we say, well, why did God create this? Why did God bring this about? But I mean, it's a very, very venerable tradition in philosophy, going back at least as far as Plato, that reality is constituted out of the good. That, reality itself is good. And obviously, we see that in scripture as well. We see that in Genesis, the very act of creating, the things that, do exist, God sees them to be good. But back to Plato, back to philosophy. Plato's view is that reality itself is good. And I mean, that goes through the Neoplatonic tradition. It's influenced in St. Augustine. You find it in Aquinas. But why would anybody think that? Why would anybody think that, reality coincides with the good? Reality itself is good. Why not think of it as evil, and then the good is just some sort of something parasitical upon what's evil? Yeah. Why give center place to the good? And I think there's a good reason to do so. You get it in Thomas, you get it in the Platonists, and it's this: when you think of the good is something which completes or perfects some sort of causal process. Okay, so it brings about the actualization of a causal process which has begun. So I'm going to give a pretty mundane example. Food is a particular good, okay, when your stomach is empty, all right? You're lacking in food, or at the minute I'm lacking in coffee, and, this headache that I'm starting to get is, sort of my body, screaming for caffeine, right? So those are particular goods. Caffeine is a great good. Those are particular goods, okay? And some sort of, causal process has been initiated whereby your body is kind of like, right, I want me some of that. Okay, I want to get some of that. So I don't know what time it is over there. It's coming up to sort of dinner time here in Ireland. We're coming up to 4 o'clock. So starting to get hungry, I'm thinking after this, I'm going to go make myself something. Okay, so I'm lacking in food at the minute. I have some sort of lack. It's making me hungry, soon enough it'll not be too pleasant. The lack of caffeine is just not pleasant whatsoever. It's suffering. So they're suffering on a lack, okay? I go to the fridge, I get the food, I eat the food, I am literally completed, okay? I receive some sort of actuality and I'm literally fulfilled. That is a good for me. Now, if I were already filled, eating more food wouldn't be good for me. It would either make me sick, or it would, make me overweight, make me unhealthy. I've given up coffee because I was taking too much caffeine and I was starting to get really sick from it. So again, taking it, whenever, you don't need it is not a good for you. But what this illustrates is that the good is some kind of actuality. It's perfective. It completes the thing. And if the good is some kind of actuality, then things which are actual are characterized as good.
Yeah.
So the actuality of things then is characterized as good. That then means that its co-opposite evil, it consists in a lack of actuality, some sort of deprivation. So the headache that I'm getting at the minute is because I've been deprived of caffeine for about 12 hours. The sort of suffering that you undergo when you're really intensely hungry, that sort of thing, it's because you've been deprived of food. Yeah. You're deprived of some sort of actuality, and that's then is the reason for evil as a privation. So when it comes to creation, when it comes to creatures, then the sort of the route that I take is that God creates things that exist. He grants existence to things. So he makes things actual. That's what God's creating is. Well, if actuality is characterized, by goodness, then everything that God creates is good. He doesn't create anything evil. Yet everything that God creates is limited in the good, because only God is goodness per se. Only God is the good itself. Everything else just participates in the good to a certain extent, and that's fair enough. But they're limited instances of the good, and because of that because they are limited instances of the good, there's grounds then for, deprivations of the good to come in, either through, freely willed creatures making poor choices, or through, two individual goods just crossing each other's paths like a lion or a zebra. And that's kind of, the overall defense of the problem of evil I would take. But I think it is important to get that metaphysics right.
Oh, hugely, because there's a problem. I think it's a total pseudo problem, kind of in the contemporary debate about this evil God challenge, right? Like maybe God's evil, right? And I think this is the problem of engaging in these types of conversations without doing the metaphysics, right? to see this fundamental asymmetry between goodness and evil. So even if you don't go all the way to the privation theory, which I think you should, there's clearly an asymmetry between goodness and evil as to which is more fundamental. You cannot make sense of evil unless there's already some good that it is drawing away from, attacking, parasitic upon. Right.
Yeah.
So and even like to make sense of good and evil, you need a moral standard, right? And that standard itself will be a good thing in the function that it serves and does, right? So clearly, whatever is more fundamental in reality is goodness. And if you think whatever else God is, he's the most fundamental aspect of reality, there's no way that you're ever going to make sense of an evil God, right? But unless you're doing the traditional metaphysics, you might be confused on this, right? and as I would argue, many people are. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's not, I guess, the traditional problem of evil, but it's something that's kind of come up in recent conversations that I think just results again from just people just not doing the metaphysics, right?
Yeah. And I mean, obviously a lot of, contemporary philosophy isn't informed by, a sort of systematic metaphysics that, our classical philosophers did engage in. But Pat, that's my sort of approach to the problem of evil. Now, you take a slightly different approach, or maybe just have a different focus. Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, I have. I think, a lot of different approaches. So I agree with everything you just said, right? There's nothing in that I don't accept. And I think it's all really useful and helpful. I just like to, and you actually brought up part of the solution to natural evils, right? Where the goodness of a lion might actually result in the privation of the gazelle or whatever the lion's eating, right? And that's just what it means to live in a material world with different beings, right? Now we can talk about that as we move further along. I also want to talk briefly about sin and what sin is, because how is this susceptible to the privation theory? I think this is important, right? Because it seems like when let's just take a weird example, right? If I decide like I want money, that's fine. That's not a terrible thing in and of itself. We need some money, right? But then I walk outside and I stab somebody in the neck to get money. It seems like there's a lot of positive being in there. I'm flexing muscles. I have a knife, right? And we just said like, hey, all being is good, right? God's creating it. So is God the cause of sin here? What's going on, right? And so I want to talk about this a little bit. And what I want to say is actually, all those things we just identified are fine in and of themselves, like flexing muscles, good. A knife, that's fine. We use knives for anything in there, good, right? So where does the privation account come in? Well, it comes in very subtly as follows. It comes in because at some point I was not considering a moral rule, right? So I was negating, right? I was non-acting, as Maritain calls it, right? Now that's fine in and of itself. I don't have to consider all moral rules at all times, right? And in fact, we can't. That's just not even reasonable, right? I can't consider all things at all times, right? So that itself isn't an evil. Like I don't need to always be thinking, thou shalt not stab innocent people in the neck, right? I don't need to always be considering that moral rule. It wouldn't even be relevant, let alone it might not even be possible, right? However, if I then decide to perform a particular action of getting money, and then I make a decision on a course of action without considering a moral rule that would perfect that action or keep that action right, then we have something missing that should have been there, but that isn't, right? We have a particular judgment. The judgment is defective. The judgment is missing something that should have been there, which is the consideration of the thou shalt or thou shalt not, right? So it's what's missing in the order of reason or particular judgment. It's that's the privation. And that is our fault, right? And that gets into the conversation that we just had previously about freedom of the will and many other things. But I just wanted to highlight specifically how the privation theory helps to make sense of sin itself, even with now it's true, like anything positive that went in action, like that's only there because of God, right? And God's permitting that. He's allowing that action to go through. He is. There's no denying that, right? But what's missing from there is something that isn't caused by God because it's not something that exists in the first place, right? And so that's how you start to kind of move the privation theory into the issue of moral fault, moral sin.
Now, here's something I want to bring up, Pat, because I kind of want to stick with sin in the conversation, not in my life. Okay, so grace. Where does grace fit in to that situation? Does God's grace is God's grace operative in keeping the sort of the rule before our minds? So if God grants us the grace to avoid a sin, is that operative in keeping the rule before our minds, or is it operative when we're forming a judgment in a particular situation?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah, I'm asking what your views are.
I'm going to go with Maritain at that. I think that God in the general run gives shatterable motions, So God will give us particular motions. Now, how he gives that to us, right? Whether it's maybe it's like before I go and stab somebody in the neck, there's literally a sign on the road that says don't kill people, right? And so God gave a motion there, right? But then I looked away. Then I looked away from the motion. So it was there before I made the judgment, right? But it was something that I could negate or annihilate, as Maritain says, and then the judgment could still be defective. Now, could God have in one stroke infallibly movement? Yes, of course. We hold that that's the exception, but in the general run, he's not going to do it. So I would say I'm broadly in line with Maritain's account on that.
No, good. No, I agree as well. Now, that pertains to sort of sins which are a result of judgments, that we, particular sins that we do. Obviously, that doesn't pertain to original sin, which is, a state that we're in. But conceivably then, God could provide the grace for an individual to go their entire life without making any bad judgments and falling into sin. Would you agree?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And, obviously, we do believe as Catholics that, the Immaculate Conception, okay, no original sin, but also the grace not to commit any individual sins as well. And the Immaculate Conception fits right in with that sort of, what would you call it, moral psychology that you've been outlining.
Right. And that's why I wanted to emphasize at the beginning our natural fallibility, right? Because I think if that's overlooked, it's hard to answer like the why question. Well, why doesn't God give us? Why doesn't God just make a blessed mothers of us all, right? Essentially, right?
Yeah. But it's important to point out that it's through grace that Our Lady was, free from sin. It was through God's grace. It was through God working in her. It was not through herself. She was not her own savior. It was through the grace of God working in her. I mean, that is an important point to bring out. It's 100%. Not by nature because she has a human nature. It's by God's grace given to her.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. No disagreement there. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Now you said, I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on that, but I think there are actually ways that we can use the problem of evil as well. Because traditionally it's used as an argument against theism. I think that theists can legitimately flip it and use it as arguments for theism, but I don't want to get ahead of myself if there's anything more we want to say on this aspect.
No, because I know you have a paper on that. I'm actually conscious that Michael hasn't in the last 48 minutes brought anything up.
I think he's watching Star Trek actually.
No. I'm listening. I'm a fly on the wall though. There's little that I could contribute that y'all wouldn't be able to already offer, so I'm just listening.
At any point you want us to go in a certain direction, Michael, just
I think y'all are going in a great direction. Take it however y'all want to go.
Cool.
Well, Pat, one of the things I would like to swing back to is just Stump's theodicy, that we become friends with God, that's the good, which is redemptive, of suffering. But I do think it would be interesting, to take a wee sideways onto your article, just the how we can flip the problem of evil against the atheists. So why don't you
So I have two. One was just published with Catholic Answers. Another one is actually under review. So I'm always a little hesitant to say, in case there's any blind reviewers watching, right? But whatever, we'll talk about it anyway. So the first one is it literally just went up on Catholic Answers yesterday, and this a larger development of that argument is actually in the other paper that's under review. But what I want to say is this, right? And it's actually directed more towards the evidential problem of evil, right? So at this point, we've kind of, I don't know which one we've been arguing against exactly, but certainly we've been arguing against the logical problem of evil. But this one's kind of pointed towards the evidential problem of evil. And what I do say in the article is this, right? And I'd be curious if you agree with it, Gavin. You don't, certainly I know you will let me know if you don't. Gavin's very good about that. He doesn't let you off easy. Is that evil actually provides great evidence for God. And the reason I argue that is what do you think the probability is that God would permit a world like we have, a world with this much suffering and evil. And I don't know. I honestly don't know, right? I don't think it's as low as many of the skeptics think. But here's what I want to say, is that even if you think that it is low, maybe you think it's like 0.5% is the probability that you think God would permit a world of suffering and evil like the one that we see. I want to say that's not really relevant until we can consider the degree of expectation of our experience on an alternative hypothesis, say naturalism or atheism. Because let me start off with a homely example that I borrow from Tim McGrew. He's a friend of mine. He's an epistemologist, right? So this will help set the stage. So imagine this. Imagine you're walking in the woods, right? And you encounter a cabin that looks abandoned, right? The door is kind of hanging off. There's moss all over the place, and just all appearances, you think that's an abandoned cabin, right? But then you take a look inside and you notice there's a cup of hot tea steeping there, Earl Grey tea steeping there. Well, immediately you flip your hypothesis from this is an abandoned cabin to this is an occupied cabin. Now, why do you do that, right? Well, because that data point of tea being there tells you that somebody has occupied this cabin, because you can see that the probability of that occurring on an abandoned cabin is, if not impossible, it's so far lower than if the cabin is occupied, right? That one particular data point causes you to completely reverse your starting point, your assumption, right? Now, here's what I want to say. What is the initial probability that any cabin you walk into, occupied or not, will have a cup of tea in it? Or say an occupied cabin. What's the probability that any occupied cabin will have a cup of tea in it, let alone Earl Grey? It's probably actually very low, right? It's probably very low. But that isn't the entire story. What's relevant is what that ratio is. What that ratio is concerning the degree of expectation of finding a cup of tea on an occupied cabin versus an abandoned cabin. And even if it's extremely low on the occupied cabin, you know it's so far lower on the abandoned cabin, in fact, to the point of probably being virtually impossible, that finding that cup of tea allows you to affirm this cabin is occupied, right? So that's the kind of initial stage setting. We don't have to be able to assign specific probabilities, right? This is just a basic form of reasoning we all engage in, right? So now let's talk about evil. Well, what do we need to make sense of evil? The thing that I try to point out in my article is evil itself is a contingent reality. In order to say that evil exists, that something is really and truly bad, not just that we don't like it. This is important. When we say that something is evil, we say something is really failing to meet a particular standard, right? It's really falling away from something that it ought to be or could be or should be, right? So we're committed to a moral standard. So to make sense of evil, we need a number of things. We need a moral standard to make sense of evil. We also need a contingent, fine-tuned universe. We need rational agents who can have conversations like these and reflect upon the moral standard and wonder if we're living up to it or falling short, right? Living in moral community. So my argument is that theism gives us the resources to make sense of evil. And in fact, to even expect a world where evil is possible in the first place, whereas atheism does not. Now, why is that? Well, theism, especially classical theism, it locks in a moral standard. It's guaranteed. If God is a subsistent good itself, God just is the moral standard. So we've got a moral standard on theism. Do we have a moral standard on atheism, on most forms of naturalism? Not really, right? Personally, I think it's impossible, right? If you think that fundamental reality is just a bunch of amoral physical stuff like particles and dust, like how are you ever going to build an objective moral standard from that? Maybe it's not impossible. I think it is, but it's at least exceedingly improbable, right? That's one consideration. Two is we have a contingent universe. Do we need a supreme foundation to make sense of a contingent universe? I think we do. If we don't have a contingent universe and we just have nothing, we're not going to have evil. Theism helps with that. We have rational conscious agents. Can naturalism, physicalism make sense of that? I really don't think so. So I think theism, God having reasons to create moral agents living in moral community is another datum better predicted and expected on theism than atheism. So frankly, when I'm analyzing atheism, I don't think there would be a problem of evil because I don't think there would be evil at all on atheism. So the fact that there is evil, to me, is considerable weight in favor of the theistic hypothesis, precisely because to make sense of that judgment that something is evil is contingent upon all these other facts of experience itself, that I think only theism can explain. So even if I think the initial probability is exceedingly low that God would permit a world like this one with this much suffering and evil, I think the ratio is so great that upon the final analysis, upon the appropriate substantial analysis, evil actually points in favor of theism rather than away from it. So that's this sketch, Gavin.
And would you like my reaction to it?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so what immediately jumps out at me, aside from the sort of probabilistic sort of reasoning, which I'm not a fan of, what jumps out at me is that there seems to be a presupposition of the is-ought distinction here. So the distinction between just reality as it exists and the normative status of things.
Right.
Because, and the reason why I think your account seems to presuppose the is-ought distinction is because you argued that the atheist, because it doesn't have God, just has, fundamental particles, which are non-moral things, can't get any sort of, moral normativity out of, the particles, out of the real things that we have. So that seems to commit one to the is-ought distinction. And I just don't grant the is-ought distinction. I don't think, Hume's reasoning is correct. I think, a full-blooded Aristotelian can argue, for teleology in nature, and in terms of arguing for teleology, we can argue for ends and thus goods, and we can do that. We can do just that without appealing to God. So I think
I anticipated this objection. So this is a good one, right? So and I think you might like my response. I think so. So what you're asking, Gavin, is could an Aristotelian naturalist evade my argument? That's essentially what you're asking, right?
Well, no, I hadn't finished.
Okay, sorry. Get it out there, and then I'll chime in. Yeah,
you'll probably have the same response anyway. But,
right. Yeah.
So what I kind of want to say is that an Aristotelian can make sense, of reality without God. Now, it's weird to find an Aristotelian who isn't a theist, but they are out there.
Right.
Now, with that in place, whilst the atheist may not want to talk about the problem of evil, because evil does bring in the connection of some sort of, standard, which is the good itself. I mean, I even, adopted that sort of view that evil is a deprivation of the good and not just deprivation of these, goods, which are ends or, the telos of some sort of action or whatever. The atheist is free to talk about the problem of suffering, and suffering doesn't commit us to, some sort of good from which evil is a deprivation. Suffering is, some sort of falling away from a state of non-suffering. So pain, for a particular example. We know what it's like not to feel pain, and we know what it's like to suffer pain.
Right.
And that just seems to be something programmed into us evolutionarily. And I think it's plausible to say that the atheist can, speak of the problem of suffering.
Yes.
And intelligibly. And so may be able to escape the turning of the tables that you're trying.
Yeah, so I would have a couple of responses to that. Let me take the suffering one first. Is suffering bad?
Is suffering bad?
That would be my first question. You don't have to answer it. It's rhetorical, right? So if they're going to say that there's no objective judgment that could be made about that, then they've lost the problem of evil, right? So I'm willing to grant that the atheist could get out of both the two arguments that I make, but there's going to be a cost, and the cost is that, okay, you can get out of my argument, but now you've lost the problem of evil against God's existence, right? So if you're going to make a particular judgment about suffering, aside from the point that I just don't personally like it, right? But you say, like, no, this is the way things really shouldn't be. Well, you've just brought the moral standard back in, wherever you want to ground that, right? So I think that there's going to have to be a choice there, right? They can talk about suffering, I agree, but if they're trying to push a problem of evil, then there's going to have to be a judgment about suffering that is more than just a matter of personal preference. You see what I'm saying? Right?
Can we stick with that? Because my Aristotelian atheist doesn't grant the is-ought distinction. So my Aristotelian atheist can make a moral judgment about suffering.
Right. So then
given the nature of things.
Then this is where I would go back to your other point, right?
Okay.
And to say that to be a consistent Aristotelian, you have to be a theist, right? And why is that? Because of the fifth way, right?
Okay. Sure.
So if you want to push me on these connections, and I agree, I don't think I'm not a divine command theorist. I'm an Aristotelian, right? So what is the moral standard for us? Well, it's human nature, but I'm not human nature. Right? I participate in human nature, and human nature is a reflection of the eternal law and divine reason, right? So I think to make sense of all of that, the moral standard all the way through for us, you have to be a theist. Now, I haven't just argued for that, but I imagine that you would probably go with me on that, right?
I would go with you that, just being Aristotelian does predispose you towards theism. I don't think Aristotle's proofs of God from Physics 8 or Metaphysics 12 work. I think they need to be fixed, basically, and it was the likes of Scotus Aquinas, Albert, those people who fixed them. Right. I can imagine, our Aristotelian atheists saying, well, look, I'll go with Aristotle when it comes to basic ontology and moral theory. Right. But these arguments for a first mover, I'll not go with them there because, first of all, they're physical arguments, and we've gone beyond Aristotle's physics. The argument from the metaphysics, well, it has problems with it that even, big fans of Aristotle like Aquinas saw and, had to
I agree with that.
So, I think that our Aristotelian atheists might have some moves,
Yeah. So if they're making a move where I don't agree with Aristotle's arguments in particular, I'll say, well, neither do I. But that's beside the point, right? I'm saying if you want to close the is-odd gap, you're going to need essentialism and teleology, right? And if you want essentialism and teleology, you're going to need the divine wisdom. You're going to need God to make sense of that, right? Otherwise,
that seems to be, that smuggles in sort of design, intelligent design.
So let's take a pseudo fifth way, right? So let's say let's just take the acorn example, right? Because one of the common objections to why, and if we get too far off track here, Michael, direct us back on, but this is good. This is where it gets interesting when we actually disagree. And maybe we don't disagree, but we're just sharpening our thought here. One of the common objections to final causality is how is the oak the cause of the acorn if it doesn't exist yet? Right? Because something that doesn't exist can exert causal influence, yet you're telling me that there's a teleology here, that the oak tree really is the cause of the acorn, its directedness moving through those various phases, right? So you know where I'm going with this, right? And the answer there is it does exist, but not as a concrete individual thing. Yet it exists in the prime thinker, right? That which has conceptual ability inherently and can direct things without itself being directed. Now, I think if you're going to hold on to a moral standard, you do need to say that there is an objective fact of the teleological matter there, right? As an Aristotelian, and you can do a ton of that without talking about God. I 100% agree with that. And you can even close the is-ought gap, right? Like, if I want to be happy, which I do by nature, right? So the conditional, the hypothetical becomes a categorical just given our nature, right? If I want to be happy, which I do want to be happy, then I should follow the dictates of the natural law, right? So Aristotelianism, it closes the is-ought gap. It's not even there because the conditional is always necessitated by nature. But that also assumes that there is a particular determinate nature, right? And I don't think you can give an intelligible answer to that ultimately, apart from a prime thinker, right? That which does the directing without itself being directed. So there's more moves, I admit, that I would have to make than the sketch that I gave, right?
I think I would take a different interpretation of the fifth way and of teleology, but I'll withhold that for whenever I write my reply to your article.
We could do First off, I love that when Gavin disagrees with me, he always picks up a ninja weapon, right? You sit there, play with nunchucks and swords. It makes it a lot more intimidating. Or we could just do another episode on the fifth way at some point, because it'd be interesting to see how our different ways of thinking about it. So what I want to say, Gavin, is I grant your points. They're good points. And that how I think of morality is Aristotelian at the end of the day. And that I'm not just punting to God of saying, like, we need to just like contemplate God's nature to figure out what's good of us. I don't think that that's the case at all. Obviously, I take revelation very seriously, but what's good for us depends on human nature, and it depends on those pillars of essentialism and teleology. And I think at the end of the day, we can give a metaphysical argument from that to theism, right?
Yeah. Well, I agree with that.
Right.
Yeah. So, had you completed your presentation of, your article?
Yeah, I didn't do the PSR one, but we can leave that for another conversation. I just wanted to show one way that I think that the theists can show that even if you think it's improbable that God would commit to making a world like this one, that isn't the end of the story. And in fact, on a deeper analysis, I think it actually points better to theism. Does it prove it? No, but it certainly does enough to diffuse the problem of evil. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think that's a worthy consideration. Yeah.
I have a quick question it was probably about 6 minutes ago that you said it. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, Pat. The way that I've always seen the problem of evil as pointing to God is that you can't say that, okay, well, something is evil without having a standard of goodness. And if you have a standard of goodness, you have to have an ultimate good, which would be God. So we can't even have these discussions about criticizing God for evil and creating a world that has evil without already assuming that there is a good God. It seems like that's what you were effectively getting at, but you articulated it way better than I ever would. So is that effectively what you were saying? Or
I think that's a fair, like, general sketch. But what Gaven pointed out is that the connections are a lot more subtle than that, right? And that what is good is at least on the sort of initial Aristotelian analysis will depend on the sort of thing that we're talking about, right? Okay. Gaven, would you agree with that so far? Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, it's not bad that a rock doesn't see, right? That's why we don't say it's not evil that a rock is blind, right? Because eyesight isn't a perfection of a rock, right? Right. It's a perfection of beings like us. So it's bad that Pat Flynn has to wear glasses, but it wouldn't be bad if a rock has to wear glasses, right? So to kind of, I think, really build out if we're just talking like a traditional moral argument for God, I do think a lot of the I guess popular level apologetics ones are just too crude. And I think that's where Gaven and I are in substantial agreement. What I would say is we have to, and we should take an Aristotelian approach, but then to ultimately sustain all of that, the essentialism in the teleology, we will need a theism, but that's a conversation on the fifth way.
Gotcha.
Right.
Okay. Sorry to derail that. I just needed some clarification. Yeah. Y'all can continue, though.
So one of the things I'd be interested in discussing from a philosophical point of view, and this will help us swing back to Stump and her Theodicy, is that Scripture. How can we as philosophers, engage with the problem of evil by taking into consideration Scripture and scriptural claims? Obviously, we transcend philosophy and get into theology if we accept, God's salvific plan for us, and we start arguing, well, look, this is the one and only solution to the problem of evil is Christ, and obviously we're Catholics, that's the case. God will bring everything to perfection through Christ. But as philosophers, is there any way to engage with Scripture that can give us some sort of resolution to the problem of evil? And I think Stump's book, Wandering in Darkness, just did a tremendous job of this. What do you think, Pat?
I like I said, it's my favorite book. And if I were to recommend one book on the problem of evil, actually, if I could just recommend a pairing, I would recommend her Wandering in Darkness and her new book, Atonement. Yeah.
She gave me a copy of Atonement, and I hope she's not listening. I still haven't read it yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, it builds off the account. It builds more into grace, justifications, the role suffering plays in that, and mutual indwelling specifically. Yeah. So it's just the nice thing about Stump's kind of like, I guess, 3 volumes really. Aquinas, Wandering in Darkness, and Atonement is they're extremely systematic, right? They're really well integrated. So yeah. Even if somebody doesn't agree with her accounts, you can't argue against that. She has a great way of integrating everything.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I really appreciated is that what Stump does in Wandering in Darkness is what traditionally we would have called Lectio Divina. And Lectio Divina, for anybody that doesn't know what it is, it's where you would take a short passage of scripture and you would really just contemplate it. You did, well, there was the fourfold descent, wasn't there? There was the Lectio, was it Lectio, Oratio, Meditatio, Contemplatio? And these were ways of, reading through scripture. But what you did is you took a particular text. A lot of people take the gospel of the day and they just meditate on that text to try and, get, what it's getting at. And the interesting thing about that is that whilst the divine realities are there present in the text, and, and systematic theologians can go through all of that, it also allows the text just to seep into your skin and under your pores, and you get an awful lot of philosophical insights from that. And Stump does this for a number of accounts of suffering throughout scripture. Obviously, the book of Job is in there, but the Abraham story, where he's asked to sacrifice Isaac, and this is the one that really struck me that I'd like to talk about, but there's other stories in there as well, such as Martha and Mary and Bethany. So would it be all right if I spoke about the Abraham story?
Yeah, let's do it. And I guess at this point we can say now we're just starting to explore Theodicies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So whenever Stump, she takes the Abraham story, and one thing that she notes that St. Paul says about Abraham is that he was the father of the faith and that he was a friend of God. Okay. Now, I mean, we can read that in St. Paul and we think he's a friend of God. And, growing up Catholics or Christians, we were always told, that God is our friend. But we actually think, the creator of the universe, pure subsistent existence itself, the egoic self, is my friend. I am a friend with him, So that's something to ponder. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind when it comes to Abraham, father of the faith, friend of God. And she starts with the beginning of Abraham's story. I think Abraham's 75 years old, isn't it? When God asks him, to leave his family and go wandering. And it's on the promise of a progeny. So it's on the promise of a child. And Stump takes us through the story. And we know the story. Abraham, he does what he's asked. A number of years later, child still hasn't come. God repeats the problem. Child still hasn't come. Abraham is doubting God. So what does he do? He decides, well, he doesn't decide. He undertakes, to have a child with his maidservant, Hagar, I think is the name. And then they have Ishmael, and Abraham thinks, oh, well, look, this is God's promise. But God very quickly goes, no, it's going to be with your wife, Sarah. Abraham's 75. She's a queer age as well. And so it's not until I think that Abraham is around about 100, isn't it, where his son is born, Isaac, and this is the child, that was promised to Abraham. But then we got a tricky family situation here. He's got Isaac with Sarah, he's got Ishmael with Hagar. Abraham, he loves Ishmael. He's had Ishmael. At the next point of the story, he's had Ishmael, I think, nearly for about 14 years. But it's a tricky family situation. And at a weaning party for Isaac, Sarah gets a bit annoyed with Ishmael, thinks Ishmael's making fun of Isaac, so tells Abraham to dismiss Hagar and Ishmael. Interesting that Sarah tells Abraham to dismiss Hagar. She didn't do anything. She wasn't there. It was Ishmael seemed to be, doing something to annoy Isaac, but yet Sarah wants them both ousted. That sort of suggests that, there's tension here. Sarah's not really happy about Hagar, Ishmael. Why would she be? This is, the maidservant and, son of her husband, with a different woman. So Abraham's like, don't know what to do. This is my child. And God appears to Abraham and says, no, look, do what Sarah asks, but not because Sarah's right, but because Abraham wants to bless Hagar and Ishmael. So Abraham, dismisses Hagar and Ishmael, and Stump really brings this out really beautifully. It suited Abraham to do that. That suited him to do God's will. Now, remember, up to this point, Abraham was sort of doubting God's will for him. Am I really going to get a son? And he even undertook to have a son with Hagar to fulfill God's will. Sarah asks Abraham to dismiss Hagar and Ishmael. God says, yeah, do it. It suited him. Abraham's like, oh, well, of course, God. Yes, absolutely, I'll do that. And then the very next event then. So Abraham does God's will when it suits him. The very next event that we get in the story, God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. And Stump brings this out beautifully. Abraham did God's will when it suits him. Is he going to do God's will when it doesn't suit him?
Right.
Exactly.
He's got this double-mindedness. That's a big thing that Stump focuses on, right?
Yeah. And the thing is, Abraham is being asked, is God still going to be faithful to his promise? Okay, his promise of a son. And Abraham has to ask himself, am I still going to have my son, even if I'm being asked to sacrifice him by God? We know the answer, that Abraham, finally he's at a point, his character is at such a point that he does have faith in God's promise to him, that he knows that he will retain his son, even if God is asking him to sacrifice him. And now the point here that Stump draws out is that the suffering undergone by Abraham, okay, so the suffering that he undergoes, God is able to redeem it. God is able to take that suffering and redeem it and bring about some good from it. What is the good which is brought about from it? God himself. God is the good that Abraham gets to enjoy as a result of the suffering he has undergone. The point then is that all suffering, through this story, but through other stories that Stump, considers, all suffering has a redemptive value to it. One is able to form one's character in such a way that they can be united with God and become a friend with God through that suffering. Now, that's not the only way that you can become a friend with God. We've got the sacraments, but suffering then can take on a redemptive value by which one can become a friend with God, right, the creator of the universe. And that's Stump's Theodicy. I mean, I found that really interesting when I first read it.
I think it's beautiful on many levels, and it's got multiple layers, just like her atonement book does. And so you gotta patiently pour through that book. And gentle listeners, if you get that book, you can just go right to the biblical narrative section. You could just start right there and then read the rest of it, because it's so beautiful. And the other point I want to emphasize about that, Gavin, is that Stump emphasizes the two poles, the objective pole and the subjective pole, right?
Yeah.
The God wants our objective flourishing, us to attain the highest good that is possible, which is, of course, friendships, love, and communion with him, right? That's the ultimate. However, God also wants to give us the desires of our heart, right? That God cares about the things that we care about because we care about it. That's the subjective pole. And she quotes Psalm, and I forget what Psalm it is right there, but there's biblical data that says that, like, God actually cares about the things we care about because we care about it, right? So for God, it's a both and. So not only does is Abraham, get God, but he also gets the other thing he cared about, which was to be the true father of faith, right? The true father of faith, right?
That's his progeny.
Right. And he got that because of those trials that he endured, right? And so a big part of Stump's Theodicy with suffering is that God will allow suffering if and only if it delivers some outweighing benefit primarily to the sufferer, right? Primarily to the sufferer. Now, there's multiple ways that one could think about that, and you think about them in different ways, either prior to or after justification as well. That's another important point. Like, suffering might be what brings somebody to the point of becoming acquiescent in their will, right? Because Stump wants to argue, she's got a deep metaphysics of the will, that God isn't just going to unilaterally, if you're resisting God, through formal causality, give you the form of justification, right? Now, you can't earn it. You can't get it yourself. That would be Pelagianism, but you could at least stop resisting. You could come to kind of like a metaphysical neutral with your will, and suffering could help get you there. And that's when God can bring you to justification. So suffering can have a unique purpose leading up to justification. And then post justification, some kind of talks about like now you're enlisted, buddy, right? And now you're signed up. Now it's time to go. And now, like, that doesn't mean your suffering ends now, right? Now it's on the road to glory. Right now. And so there's kind of like two aspects there of the way that you can think about it, both prior to and post justification. Now, to the extent that somebody buys all that will also kind of hinge upon whether they think that some sort of metaphysics of the will in general is correct. So those are obviously deep and thorny issues. I will say that I myself am extremely attracted to it. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So yeah,
absolutely. I think Stump on the soul, on the metaphysics of the will, I mean, top notch, can't be beat, Thomistically speaking. But the interesting point about that Theodicy is that we're engaged, but we're not yet being asked to accept revealed doctrine in teasing out, the problem of evil through that narrative of scripture. So we're not being asked to accept that, Christ is God, one person and two natures, all of that. Well, I mean, obviously we are committed to God, but we're committed to that prior to doing the systematic theology. So this reflection on Scripture, philosophical reflection on Scripture, fits in with that whole metaphysics of the will, allows her to construct this theodicy even before going into theology. Then when we go into our theology, it's so much more illuminated and richer.
Right. Yeah. So get Stump's book. That's the short of it.
Yeah.
There's one other thing I want to mention, and I know, Michael, I think we want to do some Q&A here, right? This is just an important consideration, and I have just a few things to say about it. This is another sort of defense that somebody like Brian Davis would give, right? And that is that we have to remember that God is not a moral agent, right? And what he really means by that is that the moral obligations we have, they follow from or flow from our having a human nature, right? And what perfects human nature. So it's always going to be a mistake, a category mistake, Davis would say, to try and indict God for lacking some like moral virtue that wouldn't even apply to God in the first place. Now, I have mixed feelings about that type of approach. In one sense, I think it's absolutely correct, right? But in another sense, I think sometimes people can take that defense a little too far and think that we can have no moral expectations of God whatsoever. So I tend to strike a middle path there and say, like, yes, it's true, God is not a moral agent like us, but we still know enough about God's nature is perfectly good, wise, and just that we can have at least general expectations of God, right? For example, like, I'm pretty confident that God wouldn't create a world with just one burning kitten in it for all eternity, right? And that's not because God has obligations to kittens, but because it's nonsense, right? And God isn't in the business of nonsense. So that's often a defense that's out there. And The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil by Father Brian Davis is a remarkable book, and I highly endorse it. And I think it's a tremendous defense. I always just personally like to qualify it at least that much. Gavin, I don't know if you just had any thoughts on that at all.
No, I mean, it sounds fair enough to me. I'm hesitant to say, that God isn't a moral agent. I mean, I think we can do all the qualifications that we want, to say, well, look, God doesn't have a responsibility to this, that, or the other. He's not under, any sort of, higher sort of good, which, requires him to act in such a way and all the rest. But I think we can maybe call God a moral agent in, the good old Thomistic fashion, in an analogical sense, right. Whereby the thing attributed to God is true, and the same for humans, but the mode in which it is attributed to God is different. So the way in which God is a moral agent is different from the way in which humans are a moral agent. Okay. So I would want to say the sort of things that you're saying, Pat, cool. That there are certain, actions that God will not undertake. Not because, he has some sort of obligation, but because he is the good itself.
They contradict his nature, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. We're good. We're in firm agreement with that then, it seems.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, the whole business of God being a moral agent, I think we just need to bring in the doctrine of analogy here, and that'll sort of, untie some of those tricky knots.
Cool. Good. All right.
So, Q&A then.
Yeah, one of the questions that I'm seeing here is from Grant Michael. Is evil solely a privation of the good?
So, do you want me to take that one, Pat?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I would say evil is solely a privation of the good, but one has to understand that in the the strict metaphysical sense that I was giving earlier, that the good is what is actual. So evil, as the opposite of the good, is some sort of deprivation of actuality, and then we need to apply that in whatever particular instance we are considering evil. So if it's a case of moral evil, we need to apply it to the metaphysics of the will that we were talking about earlier. If it's a case of natural evil, then we need to apply it to the case, of, some, let's say, one animal eating another animal. We have two individual goods, and, one's good, is, the other's evil if the other's getting eaten.
Right. Yeah. I would just go back to another, I think it's an important distinction that's often overlooked between a negation and a privation, right? Certain things are in a particular way and they are not in other ways, but that doesn't mean that they're suffering a privation necessarily. So again, like, it's not a privation that a rock is blind. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to say that a rock is blind, really. It's something the rock doesn't have, but it's not something that's due to the nature of a rock, for example, right? And the reason this is important is in the metaphysics of sin. This is what Aquinas emphasized importantly, and then Maritain really further developed, is that there has to be a negation that precedes the privation, right? Because if we're trying to explain how evil enters reality and how we are only the first cause of evil, we can't explain it with an endless chain of privations, right? Because then we don't really have an explanation, right? So what we have first is a negation, right? That we just don't use or don't consider something, but we do it in a context where we're not morally obligated to, right? So for example, like I'm not morally obligated to consider that I shouldn't stab some innocent person in the neck at all times because I'm not always making judgments where that's going to apply, right? But if I do make a judgment where I should have considered the rule, where that moral rule should inform that particular judgment, then I transform the negation into a privation, and then I have introduced sin or absurdity. That's how Lonergan thinks of sin. He calls it absurd, an objective falsity, right, into reality. So I think that one must realize that not everything missing is a privation. It might just be a negation. But if something is missing that should be there, then it's a privation, right?
What would you say to the charge that when a gazelle is being eaten, its pain centers are positively firing, and therefore pain is not only a privation?
Yeah, quick response. I don't think pain is necessarily a privation. I think pain is a good thing in many respects, right? It helps keep us alive. Gavin and I often probably feel pain in our workouts, and we think that's a good thing. Where pain could be a privation is if it causes us to lose something that should be there in a particular situation, like tranquility of mind or something like that. So that would just be my initial comment. Yeah.
So what is the privation involved here? So, I mean, agreeing with Pat, pain isn't an evil. Okay. So the experience of pain isn't actually what's evil, because pain in itself, as the firing of C fibers and all the rest, that's, is a particular good that we have. It's something which is actual and therefore a good. It's the situation which is evil. And so it's the situation which is deprived of some sort of goodness, let's say, some sort of actuality which should be there, which isn't there, such as tranquility of mind or something else like that. So the pain itself isn't an evil. It's the situation within which the pain occurs, which can be described as good or evil.
Right.
Don asks, unrelated question, but are you, Pat, Gavin, a corruptionist or survivalist in regards to the soul after death? And what position do you think Aquinas held?
Yeah, good. Do you want me to take this, Pat? People have been getting on to me about this and related matters, kind of like the A theory and the B theory of time. I'm not too sure which ism applies to which position, so I'll just give you my position, and you can, and I think this is Aquinas's position, and you can, sort of categorize it accordingly. So, for Thomas, all material substances are composed of matter and form. And there is an exclusive disjunction between living and non-living substances. Now, living substances are not non-living substances and vice versa. So you've got animate and inanimate substances. Now, what is it that distinguishes them? It can't be their matter, because they have their matter in common. Okay, so they share their matter in common. So that can't be what distinguishes them. Thus, it must be their form. Living substances are put together in a certain way that non-living substances aren't. So living substances have a special kind of form which makes them alive, and this is what Aristotle called anima. Hence we say it's animate. Well, actually, Aristotle called it psyche or psyche, and the Latins call it anima, and that's translated as soul. So the soul is the form of the body. Fast forward then to the human soul. The human soul is the rational soul. It is the soul by which the human being is alive and can perform the living operations that the human being performs. Now, forms are individuated by their matter. So take, for example, the form of the statue of David. So statue of David, big naked guy holding a slingshot, right? So that's the form of that statue. It's individuated in the marble in which it is found, but it's also individuated in all the other sorts of, copies of the statue of David. That's why you have many Davids, but one form of David. Okay, so that's the Aristotelian position through and through. Now, on that position, if a form loses its matter, it's no longer individual because it no longer has its individuating condition. So it's difficult to see how for Aristotle the individual soul could survive after death. But introduce my friend St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas didn't hold that the form is the highest principle of actuality in the thing. Beyond form as a principle of actuality, you have the act of existence. So the matter-form composite, which is the human being, has an active existence. And the act of existence is individuated to the human being whose act it is. So my act of existence is mine, and it's not my daughter's. I was in existence before she received her act of existence, and God willing, I will go out of existence whenever, and she will remain in existence. Okay. Now, there's a technical point here. Thomas holds that it is form which gives existence to the thing. Now, when he says that, he doesn't mean that the form is the active existence of the thing, but as the highest principle of actuality in the thing, the active existence is mediated to the thing through the form. So the matter participates for its actuality in the form, and the form participates for its actuality in the active existence. The active existence then is individuated to the individual whose act of existence it is, so that if that individual loses its matter, it hasn't lost its individual active existence, because the form still has that individual active existence, and so it exists still as the individual form that it is after death. So after death, the soul of the individual soul, remains in existence, but it's an incomplete state because souls, are their co-relative principle are their bodies, and so it strives to return to its body. So the soul will ever only be truly in a complete happy state whenever it's reunited with its body, and obviously that's the resurrection. Right. So that's the position I take on soul survival after death.
Yeah, I'll just say for anybody who follows my channel, I'm hoping to have both Jim Madden and Christopher Tomaszewski on to discuss corruptionism and survivalism in the future. So if you're interested in that, you might want to just keep an eye out.
I think that's what his doctoral dissertation is on, right?
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Gentlemen, I want to thank y'all so much for coming on. I hate to cut it a little bit early here, but we had to move around a couple shows, and I got one with Dr. Joy coming up in 20 minutes that I got to get ready for. So I appreciate y'all coming on and doing this. Y'all are extremely well-versed in matters of philosophy, and I've appreciated y'all coming on every time. It's very, very helpful. Well, y'all are welcome on anytime. By the way, did y'all want to put in a plug for anything that you're doing right now?
Yeah, a few quick things. Gavin and I are writing a book together, so keep an eye out for that. That probably is at least a year off until that's released. So we'll be given a treatment of the 5 ways. And we'll be taking up probably some of the issues we discussed here as well. So that's in the works. Otherwise, Gavin and I have many fun conversations like these over on my podcast, the Pat Flynn Show, if anyone's interested in that. But Gavin, what have you been up to?
Yes, so I'm writing this book with Pat, and I've just discovered we disagree on the 5th way, so that's going to be fun.
We'll have to hash that one out once we get to that one. Yeah.
I'm also writing a book on Aquinas' classical theism. So I actually did a word count the other day. I'm over 40,000 words, so I'm pleased about that, and I'm still on God. What else am I doing? I've got a few articles coming out. I've got an article on the 1st way coming out. My article on existential inertia just appeared in Divinitas. I've got an article on the 4th way coming out. I'm writing an article on God as a causal agent, as an intentional causal agent, because I know this whole issue of, how God can remain immutable when, creatures can be different. Surely that would require, a different act of the will on God. I'm writing an article on that, more to do with, in the philosophy of intentionality than anything else. And other than that, I'm not drinking coffee.
Gavin, I want to ask you a question. Do you ever take one of those swords and just swing it? Because I want to take one of them and just swing it at a tree and chop something down with it.
Well, I do whenever I'm training, but
So you do some sword training? Okay.
Yeah, I've never chopped at a tree, but when I'm doing the sword forms and stuff, yeah, it gets swung about and I'm leaping through the air and all. Yeah, so
When I see a sword, that's the urge that I get, is to just
really,
chop at it. So yeah, but
Oh,
I
very
don't
good.
have any kind of training. So
Yeah. Well, if you get your katana and find some sort of coach, and just learn how to do the katana swipe.
I have not only the katana, but then I have one of those. I guess it's a wooden sword that you're supposed to train with.
A boken.
Yeah, boken. Yeah, I have one of those, but I've never done anything with it.
Right. No, you should. Everybody should do martial arts.
Yeah. I think that would be fun. Anyways, gentlemen, thank y'all so much for coming on. I appreciate y'all's time. Like I said, y'all are welcome on anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
It's been a
very
blast,
much.
as always.
Yeah.
Thank
Love
you,
this.
Gavin.
Thank you.
And everyone, thank y'all for watching. I appreciate the comments there, the questions. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe. Check us out at patreon.com/reason and theology as well if you want to support us. All right, that'll do it. Till next time. God bless you all.